The village of Willow's Edge had always been a place where time seemed to move slower, a quiet refuge bordered by rolling hills and dense woods. At the heart of the village, there stood an old Victorian house, once brimming with the laughter of a young girl named Evelyn and her mother, Clara. The house had seen better days, but its worn exterior spoke of a family once bound by love and warmth. Evelyn was just 10 years old when tragedy struck her world. Clara, her mother, was the glue that held the family together, a compassionate woman known for her bright smile and kind heart. She had a knack for turning mundane days into magical memories, filling the house with stories, songs, and the scent of freshly baked bread. But a cruel illness took Clara away, leaving Evelyn and her father, Henry, to navigate their grief. Henry was a man of few words, a carpenter by trade whose hands were calloused from years of hard work. Though he loved his daughter deeply, the loss of Clara left a void in him that he didn't know how to fill. He buried himself in his work, leaving Evelyn to seek comfort in the memories of her mother. For a while, the two of them managed to find a semblance of balance in their sorrow, leaning on each other in quiet understanding. 2 years after Clara's death, Henry announced he had met someone. Margaret entered their lives like a storm, bold, confident, and strikingly beautiful. She was everything Clara had not been: glamorous, outspoken, and, as Evelyn soon discovered, cunningly manipulative. Henry, desperate to move on and give Evelyn a mother figure, ignored the subtle warning signs. He mistook Margaret's charm for genuine affection, not realizing the darkness hidden behind her polished exterior. Margaret's backstory was shrouded in mystery. She had grown up in a wealthy family that had fallen on hard times. Her upbringing was marked by entitlement and a relentless drive to reclaim the lifestyle she believed she deserved. Marrying Henry was, to her, a means to an end. His modest wealth and the stability he offered were her ticket to a comfortable life. At first, Margaret played the part of the caring stepmother well. She brought gifts for Evelyn, helped decorate her room, and cooked elaborate meals to impress Henry. But beneath the surface, Margaret's disdain for Evelyn simmered. The child's innocence and her unwavering attachment to Clara were constant reminders of Margaret's position as an outsider in the family. It started with small things. Margaret would make snide remarks about Evelyn's childish behavior, scold her for imaginary infractions, or deliberately exclude her from conversations. Evelyn, eager to please, tried to adapt, but her efforts were met with increasing hostility. Margaret's true nature began to reveal itself in private moments when Henry was not around. "Your father works too hard to deal with your nonsense," Margaret snapped one evening when Evelyn spilled a glass of milk. "You're not a little princess anymore. Grow up." Evelyn's heart sank, but she didn't dare talk back. She found solace in her room, where she kept a collection of her mother's belongings, a locket, a journal, and an old photograph of Clara holding a younger Evelyn. These relics became her refuge, a reminder of a time when she felt truly loved. Henry, blinded by his love for Margaret, failed to see the cracks forming in their family. Margaret was careful to maintain her facade around him, showering him with affection and praise. She even convinced him to send Evelyn to a boarding school, claiming it would help her grow into a strong, independent young lady. Evelyn protested, but her voice was drowned out by Margaret's persuasive arguments. Reluctantly, Henry agreed, and Evelyn was sent away. The school was a cold, unfamiliar place, and though Evelyn excelled academically, she felt isolated. Letters to her father went unanswered, and her visits home during holidays were tense and joyless. Margaret's grip on the household tightened, and Evelyn's sense of belonging eroded further. Despite the growing darkness in her life, Evelyn tried to hold on to the light within her. She made friends at school, excelled in art and literature, and kept her mother's memory alive through her drawings and writings. Her teachers often praised her talent, noting how her work was filled with vivid imagery and raw emotions. But even as Evelyn grew older, the weight of Margaret's cruelty never lessened. The rare moments she spent at home were marred by sharp words, cold stares, and a sense of being unwelcome. Henry, though loving, remained oblivious to his daughter's pain, too caught up in his work and Margaret's manipulations. As Evelyn approached her 18th birthday, the tension in the household reached a breaking point. Margaret's cruelty had become more overt, and Evelyn, no longer a child, began to push back. Their arguments grew more frequent and heated, with Margaret accusing Evelyn of being ungrateful and disrespectful. "You think you're so clever," Margaret sneered one evening after a particularly vicious exchange. "You're nothing but a burden, just like your mother was." Evelyn's heart shattered at those words, but she refused to let Margaret see her cry. She retreated to her room, clutching the locket her mother had given her, and vowed to find a way to escape the suffocating environment. Little did she know, the path ahead would be far more treacherous than she could have imagined. Evelyn's 18th birthday dawned cold and gray, the skies over Willow's edge thick with clouds that promised rain. The day held little significance for her. It was a milestone she had long anticipated, but not for celebration. To Evelyn, 18 marked the age when she could finally leave her father's house, a place that had once been her sanctuary but had since turned into a battlefield. The day began like any other, with Margaret issuing sharp commands from the kitchen. "Evelyn, are you deaf? I told you to clean the dining room. And don't forget to scrub the windows, they're filthy." Her voice sliced through the air like a blade. Evelyn's fingers clenched around the dish she was drying. Over the years, Margaret's demands had grown more outrageous, her tone more venomous. Evelyn often wondered how her father could remain so blind to the daily torment she endured. Margaret's hold on the household was absolute. She managed every detail of the house with an iron fist, from the meals they ate to the way the furniture was arranged. Even Henry, who had once been the decision-maker, deferred to her judgment. Margaret had mastered the art of manipulation, wrapping Henry around her finger with sweet words and calculated affection. But her relationship with Evelyn was a stark contrast. From the moment Margaret married Henry, she had viewed Evelyn as an obstacle, a constant reminder of the life Henry had shared with Clara. To Margaret, Evelyn was not just a stepdaughter. She was a rival, a symbol of the love Henry would never fully give her. Margaret's cruelty often took on subtle forms, withholding meals, belittling Evelyn's achievements, and twisting her father's words to sow discord between them. But as Evelyn grew older, the abuse became more direct. Margaret no longer bothered to hide her disdain. That morning, Evelyn was scrubbing the dining room windows when her father entered the room, carrying a small gift wrapped in brown paper. He looked hesitant, almost nervous, as he handed it to her. "Happy birthday, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. Evelyn's heart ached at the sight of him. She could see the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, the weight of Margaret's influence dragging him down. She took the gift and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. "Thank you, Dad," she said, forcing a smile. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Oh, how thoughtful," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "A journal, because that's exactly what she needs. A reason to sit around daydreaming all day." Henry glanced at Margaret, his expression uneasy, but he said nothing. Evelyn bit her tongue, unwilling to spoil the moment with an argument. Later that day, Evelyn retreated to her room with the journal. The small space was her refuge, its walls lined with books and sketches she had collected over the years. On her bedside table sat a framed photograph of her mother, Clara, smiling with an openness that seemed to light up the room. Evelyn traced the edge of the frame with her fingers, her mind drifting back to memories of her mother. Clara had been everything Margaret was not: gentle, understanding, and endlessly supportive. Evelyn often wondered how different her life might have been if Clara had lived. Would her father have remarried? Would Margaret have ever ended their lives? The journal reminded her of the stories Clara used to tell, tales of brave heroines who overcame impossible odds. Evelyn decided she would use the journal to write her own story, documenting her struggles and dreams. Margaret's ultimatum. That evening, Margaret summoned Evelyn to the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Henry sat in his armchair, his face a mask of resignation, while Margaret stood by the fireplace, her arms folded. "We need to discuss your future," Margaret said, her tone icy. Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're 18 now," Margaret continued. "It's time you start contributing to this household. I've arranged for you to take a job at the general store in town." Evelyn's stomach twisted. She had dreamed of leaving Willow's Edge, of attending art school in the city. The idea of being trapped under Margaret's thumb for years to come was unbearable. "I've already applied to universities," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I want to study art." Margaret's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Art? That's not a career. It's a waste of time and money. You'll take the job at the store, or you'll find somewhere else to live." Henry shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Margaret, maybe we should." "No, Henry," Margaret snapped. "She needs to learn responsibility. We've done enough for her." Evelyn looked at her father, hoping he would stand up for her, but he said nothing. Evelyn spent that night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Margaret's ultimatum had only strengthened her resolve to leave. She couldn't spend another year under Margaret's control, enduring her cruelty and watching her father grow more distant. The journal lay open on her desk, its blank pages waiting to be filled. Evelyn picked up her pen and began to write, pouring her frustration and longing onto the paper. She wrote about her dreams of freedom, her memories of her mother, and the pain of living in a house that no longer felt like home. As the first drops of rain began to fall outside, Evelyn made a silent vow. She would find a way to escape. She would carve out a life for herself, one where she could be happy and free from Margaret's shadow. But Evelyn had no idea how much darker her life was about to become. The rain continued for days after Evelyn's birthday, drumming against the roof and turning the dirt roads of Willow's Edge into muddy trails. The weather mirrored Evelyn's mood, gloomy and restless. With each passing hour, the walls of the house seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her. Margaret's ultimatum hung over her like a dark cloud. Evelyn couldn't shake the bitterness of her stepmother's words or the sting of her father's silence. She spent hours locked in her room, sketching and writing in her journal. Her art, once vibrant and full of life, now took on darker tones. Scenes of shadowy forests, crumbling castles, and lone figures wandering through endless storms. Margaret, meanwhile, was uncharacteristically quiet. She spent most of her time in the sitting room, sipping tea and staring out the window as though searching for something. To an outsider, it might have seemed like she was reflecting on her actions, but Margaret was not one for introspection. Her silence was not born of guilt, but of calculation. Margaret's own past was riddled with secrets she had never shared. Born into a wealthy family, she had grown up in luxury, but her parents' fortune had dwindled due to bad investments and lavish spending. By the time Margaret was in her 20s, the grand estate she had once called home was sold off to pay debts, leaving her with little more than her beauty and ambition. Margaret had married twice before meeting Henry, both unions ending in bitter divorces. Her first husband, a banker, had left her after discovering her penchant for deception. Her second husband, a businessman, had been no match for her manipulative tendencies. By the time she met Henry, Margaret had perfected the art of disguising her true nature. But beneath her polished exterior lay a deep well of resentment and insecurity. Margaret envied those who had what she had lost: wealth, status, and genuine affection. To her, Evelyn represented everything she despised: innocence, talent, and the unbreakable bond between father and daughter. Determined to leave, Evelyn began devising a plan. She knew that simply walking away was not an option. She needed money, a place to stay, and a way to support herself. Her savings were meager, barely enough to cover a bus ticket to the nearest city. Evelyn reached out to her friend Lila, a classmate from boarding school who lived in the city. Lila's family owned a small art studio, and she had often invited Evelyn to visit. Though they hadn't spoken much since graduation, Evelyn hoped Lila would remember her fondly. The letter she wrote was heartfelt and honest. She explained her situation, her dreams of becoming an artist, and her desperate need for a fresh start. She slipped the letter into an envelope and walked to the village post office, her heart pounding with each step. As she handed the letter to the clerk, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. It was the first proactive step she had taken toward her freedom, and it gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret, however, was not oblivious to Evelyn's growing defiance. She noticed the way Evelyn avoided her, the whispered phone calls, and the determined look in her eyes. Margaret knew she was losing control, and it infuriated her. One evening, as Evelyn was setting the table for dinner, Margaret approached her with a forced smile. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, "I've been thinking. Perhaps I've been too hard on you. I know I can be strict, but it's only because I want what's best for you." Evelyn froze, her instincts screaming that this was a trap. She looked up, meeting Margaret's gaze. "What do you mean?" Margaret sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her chest as though she were making a heartfelt confession. "I've decided to let you take some art classes in the city. It's clear you have talent, and I wouldn't want to stand in the way of your dreams." Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise, but her excitement was tempered by suspicion. Margaret's sudden change of heart didn't make sense. "Really?" Evelyn asked cautiously. "Of course," Margaret said, her smile widening. "But you'll need to earn the money for the classes yourself. That's why I've spoken to Mr. Hargrove at the general store. He's agreed to give you a job. You can save up while you work, and once you've proven you're serious about art, we can discuss the next steps." Evelyn's heart sank. Margaret's offer was nothing more than a ploy to keep her tethered to Willow's edge. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly, forcing a smile. That night, Evelyn lay awake, replaying Margaret's words in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that her stepmother was plotting something, but she didn't know what. Her instincts told her to be cautious, to move carefully, and keep her true plans hidden. The rain intensified, pounding against the windows with relentless force. Evelyn sat by the window, her journal in her lap, and watched the storm rage outside. She thought about her mother and the life she might have had if Clara were still alive. She thought about Lila and the possibility of a new beginning. But most of all, Evelyn thought about Margaret and the battle that lay ahead. She knew the road to freedom would not be easy, but she was determined to fight for it. As the storm raged on, Evelyn made a vow to herself. No matter what Margaret did, she would not let her win. Later, leaving the village cloaked in a damp chill, Evelyn awoke to a pale sun filtering through her curtains, the sound of birds timidly returning to the trees. But despite the calmer weather, the tension in the house remained thick and suffocating. Margaret's sudden generosity continued to haunt Evelyn. The offer of art classes, dangled so temptingly, felt more like a trap than a gift. Evelyn knew her stepmother too well to believe in her goodwill. She needed to remain vigilant, even as she carried on the charade of obedience. The next week, Evelyn began working at Mr. Hargrove's general store, a small but bustling shop that served as the heart of the village. Mr. Hargrove was a portly man with a booming voice and a quick smile, well-liked by everyone in Willow's Edge. He had known Evelyn since she was a child and treated her with a fatherly kindness that she hadn't experienced in years. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said one afternoon as Evelyn stocked shelves. "You've grown into a fine young lady, Evelyn. Clara always said you had a bright future ahead of you." Evelyn smiled politely, though her chest tightened at the mention of her mother. She busied herself arranging tins of biscuits, hoping Mr. Hargrove wouldn't notice the sadness in her eyes. Working at the store provided Evelyn with a temporary escape from Margaret's oppressive presence. It also allowed her to earn a modest income, though she knew it wouldn't be enough to fund her escape anytime soon. Still, the routine gave her a sense of purpose and a sliver of hope. Meanwhile, Margaret wasted no time in tightening her grip on the household. She continued to play the role of the benevolent stepmother, praising Evelyn's work at the store and feigning interest in her art. But beneath the surface, Margaret was as manipulative as ever. One evening, as Evelyn returned home from work, she overheard Margaret talking to Henry in the sitting room. "She's doing so well at the store," Margaret said, her voice syrupy sweet. "But I worry about her, Henry. She spends so much time alone. Don't you think it would be good for her to stay here a little longer? Give her some time to mature." Henry hesitated. "She's 18, Margaret. She's old enough to make her own decisions." "Of course she is," Margaret replied quickly. "But she's still so young, so naive. The city can be a dangerous place for a girl like her. I just want to make sure she's ready." Evelyn clenched her fists, her stomach churning with anger. Margaret's words were laced with false concern, designed to manipulate Henry into keeping her trapped at home. Despite Margaret's schemes, Evelyn refused to give up. She continued to write letters to Lila, though she hadn't received a reply yet. She also began selling small sketches at the general store, simple drawings of the village and its surroundings. Mr. Hargrove had kindly offered to display them near the register, and to Evelyn's surprise, they sold quickly. Each sale brought a small surge of confidence. Evelyn realized that her talent had value, that she could carve out a path for herself if she remained determined. At night, she worked on a larger piece, a detailed portrait of her mother, drawn from memory. It was her most ambitious work yet, and she poured her heart into every stroke. The portrait became her sanctuary, a reminder of the love and strength Clara had given her. One afternoon, as Evelyn was closing up the store, the postman arrived with a bundle of letters. Among them was an envelope addressed to her, written in Lila's familiar handwriting. Evelyn's heart leapt as she tore it open. The letter was warm and enthusiastic, filled with updates about Lila's life in the city. But the part that made Evelyn's breath catch was the invitation at the end. "If you ever need a place to stay, you're always welcome here. My parents would be happy to have you, and we could use some extra help at the studio. I know you'd love it here, Evelyn. Let me know if you're interested." Evelyn clutched the letter to her chest, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of genuine hope. She finally had a way out. But Evelyn knew she couldn't act too quickly. Margaret was perceptive, and any sign of rebellion would only provoke her wrath. Evelyn decided to keep the letter hidden, tucked away in the pages of her journal. She continued to play the part of the dutiful stepdaughter, all the while planning her escape. Margaret, however, was not so easily fooled. She noticed the subtle changes in Evelyn's demeanor. The way her eyes seemed brighter, the faint smile that lingered on her lips. Margaret's suspicion grew, and she began to watch Evelyn more closely, her mind churning with schemes to maintain control. As the weeks went by, Evelyn's plans began to take shape. She saved every penny she earned, secretly packing a small bag with essentials for the day she would leave. She knew the journey would be difficult, but the thought of freedom kept her going. But Margaret was not one to let go easily. Her suspicions had turned to paranoia, and she was determined to uncover whatever secret Evelyn was hiding. The fragile peace in the house was about to shatter, and Evelyn would soon find herself facing a storm far more dangerous than the one she had endured. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope for Evelyn. Every move she made was calculated, every word measured. She could feel Margaret's eyes on her constantly, watching, waiting for a slip-up. The letter from Lila remained hidden in her journal, and Evelyn had memorized every word, holding onto it like a lifeline. But Margaret's patience had its limits. She had sensed a shift in Evelyn's demeanor and knew the girl was planning something. What Margaret didn't know was how far Evelyn was willing to go to escape. One evening, Margaret confronted Evelyn as she was sketching in her room. The door burst open without warning, and Margaret strode in, her eyes blazing with suspicion. "What are you hiding?" she demanded. Evelyn froze, her pencil hovering over the page. "I'm not hiding anything," she said calmly, though her heart pounded in her chest. Margaret scoffed. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the way you've been acting. What's in that journal of yours?" Evelyn clutched the journal tightly. It's private. Margaret's expression twisted with anger. She lunged forward and snatched the journal from Evelyn's hands. No, Evelyn cried, reaching for it, but Margaret was already flipping through the pages. Her eyes landed on Lila's letter, and her face darkened. So, this is what you've been hiding, Margaret said coldly. You're planning to run away, aren't you? Evelyn's voice trembled with defiance. I have every right to leave. I'm 18 and I don't need your permission. Margaret laughed bitterly. You think you can just walk away? You're nothing without this house, without my husband's support. You'll come crawling back, just like your father did when his precious Clara died. The mention of her mother ignited a fury in Evelyn. Don't you dare talk about my mother, she shouted. Margaret's expression shifted, a flicker of something dangerous crossing her face. You don't know what it takes to survive in this world, Evelyn. You're weak, just like she was. The words hung in the air like a dagger. Evelyn felt her breath catch, the weight of Margaret's cruelty threatening to crush her. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. I'd rather be weak than become someone like you, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The confrontation marked a turning point. Margaret, enraged and humiliated, began to tighten her control over Evelyn. She forbade her from leaving the house except for work, monitored her every move, and even confiscated her earnings. Evelyn felt trapped, her dreams slipping further away with each passing day. But Evelyn was not the same timid girl Margaret had manipulated for years. She had tasted hope, and she refused to let it be taken from her. One stormy night, while the rest of the house was asleep, Evelyn made her move. She packed her bag, tucking Lila's letter into her pocket, and slipped out the back door. The rain soaked her within moments, but she didn't care. She ran down the muddy road, her heart pounding with fear and exhilaration. When Margaret discovered Evelyn's disappearance the next morning, her fury was unmatched. She ransacked the house, searching for any clue as to where Evelyn might have gone. Henry, alarmed by Margaret's behavior, tried to calm her down, but she lashed out at him, blaming him for Evelyn's rebellion. Meanwhile, Evelyn had reached the train station, clutching her ticket tightly. She boarded the train to the city, her heart swelling with a mix of fear and excitement. For the first time in years, she felt free. As the train neared the city, it derailed on a sharp curve. The crash was catastrophic, leaving dozens injured and several dead. Evelyn was among the casualties. The news of the crash reached Willow's Edge the following day. Henry was devastated, collapsing into a chair as the weight of his grief overwhelmed him. Margaret, however, was eerily silent. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt the sting of regret. She replayed every cruel word, every act of manipulation, and realized the role she had played in driving Evelyn to her death. The girl had been her rival, her scapegoat, but she had also been her responsibility. Margaret's guilt consumed her. She began to withdraw from the world, her once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of itself. Henry, unable to forgive her, filed for divorce and moved away, leaving Margaret alone in the empty house. Evelyn's death left a lasting impact on those who had known her. Mr. Hargrove dedicated a section of his store to her artwork, displaying her sketches as a tribute to her talent and resilience. Lila, heartbroken by the loss of her friend, created a scholarship in Evelyn's name to support aspiring artists. As for Margaret, she lived out the rest of her days in solitude, haunted by the memory of the girl she had pushed too far. She spent countless nights staring at the portrait Evelyn had drawn of Clara, the only piece of her stepdaughter she had kept. In the end, Margaret learned the harshest lesson of all. The pain she had inflicted on others had come full circle, leaving her with nothing but regret and an empty house filled with echoes of the past.